I've gotten one side panel attached to the lid. Before I move forward, I just want to point out that I went back and redid the seams on this zipper. In my last video I showed that they didn't turn out well because my machine was having trouble sewing through the zipper tape and 2 layers of this rubber. It bothered me enough that I wanted to go back and fix it, so I gave some thought as to what I could do different and make it work. I realized a big part of the problem was that this rubbery material was gripping either the feed dog or the presser foot, depending on which way I was sewing it. I don't know that anyone watching this video is going to be sewing through a chemical protective boot cover on a home sewing machine, but if by some chance they are, here's some things that I tried that seemed to help. First, I increased my stitch length a little bit. I'm usually between 2 and 3 on this dial, and I increased it to 3 to 4. The reason being is because the material's thick, and it kind of reminded me of sewing through leather. And if I was sewing through leather, I'd want a longer stitch. I think it makes it easier that way. I also use the dial at the top to back off some of the pressure on the presser foot. Not a lot. These 2 things alone seem to help with the issue, so long as the rubber was touching the presser foot and not the feed dog. If you have to have the rubber contacting the feed dog, then I recommend putting some kind of paper in between the material and the teeth of the feed dog. That should help with the grippiness. I thought about using newspaper, but I don't know anyone who gets newspaper anymore. I get all my news on my phone. So I grabbed the closest thing I had on hand, which was a paper towel. That seemed to work for me just fine, but I did end up with little bits of paper towel within the seam. This will all be covered by grosgrain ribbon anyway, so I'm not that bothered by it. So moving on. As I said in my last video, I sewed a seam along all 4 edges to connect the exterior panel to the interior. I then went back and sewed 1 more seam on the front and the back sides. The reason being is for added strength. Whenever I connect 2 pieces of material, I like to have a total of 3 seams. 2 usually to connect the material, and a third to attach the grosgrain ribbon. So that way all the seams will be triple strength. I haven't sewed another seam along the 2 sides because because when I connect the side panels, that seam to connect the side panel will be the 2nd seam. And then once I attach the grosgrain ribbon, that would be the 3rd seam. Okay, if I turn this inside out, give me a second here. So you can see here that I connected the grosgrain ribbon on this side already. I did use that trick that I just mentioned about with the paper towel to sew these seams and make sure it doesn't get gripped by the feed dog. And you can see a little bit of that still sticking out of the grosgrain ribbon. What I did was, on all 4 sides, I sewed the first seam with about a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then when I sewed a 2nd seam on the front and back sides, I just kind of went in between the edge of the material and the seam that I already sewed. And with the half-inch grosgrain ribbon, or pardon me, with the 1-inch grosgrain ribbon wrapped around the edges, it kind of just barely covers up that seam that's at the 3/8 inch seam allowance. So obviously my next step is going to be to attach this other side panel. After I'm done with that, I'm going to add some grosgrain ribbon all along the bottom edge of the lid. I'll get back to you when I'm done with that. I'm now finished with this pack lid. I've finished connecting the other side panel. I've covered all the edges in grosgrain. I've sewed grosgrain ribbon all along this bottom edge, and I'm happy enough with it to where I can move on. The trickiest part of building this lid, other than sewing through this rubber, was trying to sew a round edge to a straight edge. I've done this once before when I sewed a tactical duffel bag. I've made a video on that before. It's not an easy thing to do your first time. Some of the tricks I've learned from the last time I've done it is basically to use as many of these clips as you have. You know, you can have one literally every inch if that's what you need to do. And just go slow. Take your time with it and don't rush. One trick I considered trying but ultimately didn't do was to start my seam in the middle, sew down one side, flip it over, sew another seam down the other side. I ended up not doing that, but that's one thing I thought might help. I mentioned in my last video, but didn't really elaborate on it, the reason that I needed to do the pack lid first before moving on to the back panel was because I wanted these compression straps sewn to the exterior of the lid. And if I had sewn them to, well, they're also going to need to be sewn to the back panel, and if I had done that first, I would literally have to construct the lid with it already basically attached to the back panel. So I figured it would be easier to construct the lid first, do everything I need to do on the back panel, sew these compression straps to the back panel, and then there will also be some air mesh sewn to the back panel that will be covering these compression straps up. I just want to point out that maybe you already know this if you've seen one of my other videos, but I don't have any sort of special attachment for my sewing machine or any special foot to sew the bias tape or the grosgrain ribbon to the material. I literally just fold it over the material, hold it in place with clips, and then sew a seam. So if you need to sew grosgrain ribbon to a material, that's how I do it. It would be easier to have an attachment, but I don't have this sort of sewing machine that can accept an attachment like that.